As you know, back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, one of the predominant modes of thinking at that time was, of course, Francis Fukuyama's notion of the end of history. That despite the assault of several challengers throughout the 20th century, and indeed throughout all of history, but in the 20th century, namely communism and fascism, despite the temporary appeal of these alternative forms of political and economic order, essentially we had arrived at the end of history because liberal democracy and capitalism had proven itself to be most resilient. And hence he coined the term, coined the phrase, the end of history. And in many ways, one could argue that his position has been vindicated. As you read this week, this remarkable and very accessible article on what's been going on in Burma. It wasn't that long ago when one thought of Burma, one thought of the impossibilities of any notion of political reform, much like we think of, say, places like North Korea, parts of North Africa, and so on. And in fact, what we've seen in Burma is what was once an absolute impossibility, now demonstrating us the very possible allure of the end of history and indeed the institutionalization of liberal democracy. And in many ways, if you think about it, over the last month and a half, we've been talking about one of the greatest virtues of democracy being in its flexibility and its variability in absorbing different components of other types of political order. So the Marxist challenge, for instance, in terms of inequality as a result of capitalism has in many ways been absorbed or accommodated by the rise of the social democratic welfare state. So in many ways then, one can argue that democracy as a flexible set of institutions, as a variable set of institutions, has the capacity to absorb and to accommodate a lot of the valid challenges that these alternatives have raised to a liberal capitalist democratic order. There is one problem, however, and something that has been really a thorn in Frank Fukuyama's side, and that is the case of China. China, in many ways, is the most significant holdout in terms of the end of history thesis. And one must remember, when Fukuyama was thinking about the end of history, he was seeing the massive student demonstrations in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, thinking that democracy was just around the corner. If not in May and June of 1989, then most certainly democracy was soon to arrive in China, given the nationalist patriotic impulse for a push towards more political liberalization. But this hasn't happened. And in many ways, what we might see before us, unlike, say, fascism and economic forms of communism, is indeed an attractive alternative model in China. A real rival in the Chinese case that in many ways belies our assumptions of modernization theory and eludes our notions of the inevitability of democracy. And not only is China a viable alternative, in many quarters around the world, the Chinese example is increasingly seen as an attractive alternative. There are lots of countries out there and lots of leaders of countries out there that are looking to the Chinese example and looking at its 8% annual economic growth and looking at the relative stability within China and begin to think to themselves, this may not just be a viable alternative, it may be an attractive alternative.